When I was thinking this week, I was shocked to realize it's been 20 years since I walked the Camino de Santiago. It was 20 years ago in 2005. The time has passed much too rapidly. You may know about this trip. You begin in the south of France. You walk all the way across the north of Spain to get to Santiago de Compostela, where by pious legend, the remains of St. James the Apostle are in the cathedral. And there are many ways to do the walk, and there are many reasons to do it. What you may not know is you don't have to walk. You can do it on a bicycle, or you can do it on a horse. And so obviously those who are doing it in different ways have different goals. I mean, if you're going to ride a bicycle for 2 weeks, that requires a different sort of skills and a sort of preparation. I have no idea how you do it with a horse. I assume there must be stables along the way, but I wouldn't even know. But even the ones who are walking are doing it for different purposes. There's some people who are doing it strictly for the exercise, just the challenge. Can I walk through varying terrains and weather and all kinds of crazy stuff to get to this place? It'll take me 6 to 8 weeks of walking every day to get there. There are other people who are doing it for deeply religious reasons, because they believe that by making this trip, they're making an offering to God, and in some way they will gain some merit in a spiritual way by having learned about themselves, learned about their faith, learned about whatever else God has to reveal to them along the way. I certainly, as a relatively dumb young American, wasn't really thinking in any of these terms. I thought, well, I'll just try it and see how it goes. What I didn't realize was that even I had to do a fair amount of preparation, and some of it I did on the fly, I will confess. There are only so many places you can stop for the night, because there are only so many villages along the way. So you have to plan. I'm going to walk this far and stop. That's where I'm going to get my food. That's where I can sleep for the night. Everything else I might need, blister medication. And it turns out everybody else thinks the same way. So although you may walk at a different pace, and although you may stop in different places for different reasons, you end up seeing the same people again and again as you're going along the walk. I encountered Europeans who were shocked that any American was doing this. Apparently they think we all sit on the couch and eat bonbons all day. I don't know what their thoughts were. But I met a Dutch man who had walked all the way from Amsterdam. His wife came along behind with the RV, so he always had a place to sleep. But he'd gone through 2 or 3 pairs of boots, worn them out in the time he had done this trip. You meet all sorts of other people along the way, and it's in those towns each night where you encounter the people, where you make connections with them, where you talk about what you're doing, talk about why it is that you're all headed toward the same place. That's kind of what I think of when I think of the gospel story for today. There are all these people who suddenly end up in this one little frame of the story. They're all going the same place. They're all going to Jerusalem. Jesus, we know, because he has come down from the mountain of transfiguration and has said out loud, I am going to Jerusalem. My face is turned toward Jerusalem. But the same is true, I think, for everybody else in the scene. And it is instructive, I think, to think about why they're all going, what their motivations may be. I start with the Pharisees, these people who get a bad rap. They're usually the villains in the story. Depending upon which commentator you read, they're the villains in this story also. It sounds like they're trying to do a good deed, tell Jesus to get away from danger. But what the commentators point out is they're suggesting that Jesus leave one dangerous area to go to an even more dangerous area. So they're kind of trying to push him out of the frying pan and into the fire. Be that as it may, these are people who are hyper observant. They're trying to observe every commandment of God as precisely as they can. And so in some way by obedience, to gain some spiritual benefit. They are looking for God in their lives in the way that they live out their obedience to God's instructions. So you could say they're going to Jerusalem looking for God, hoping to meet God in Jerusalem. It's worth thinking, I think, in all of our minds about what it is they're going to find there. First, the irony that they have continued to meet God in person all through the story every time they have a fight with Jesus and fail to notice that that's who they're talking to. But then, the deeper problem, and the one that ultimately comes to all of us in our faith sooner or later, is when they go to Jerusalem and they do encounter God, it may not necessarily be what they were expecting. awfully easy as we go through our lives of faith, our lives of spiritual practice, to come to have a pretty clear idea of what God is, what God does, how God does it. Then we come face to face with God, some of that must necessarily fall away. It's one image to keep in mind. Second is Herod. This is complicated because this isn't the Herod you're thinking of, probably. It turns out everybody in the family was called Herod because they're all from the same family. This is Herod Antipas, who was the son of Herod the Great, who was the king when Jesus was born. Poor Herod Antipas, spare a kind thought for him. When his father died, he and all his brothers had to get shipped off to Rome so they could all argue in front of the emperor who should really get the job. And the Romans, deciding that it was better to divide and conquer, didn't give anybody the job. They gave everybody a piece of the job. And in fact, Herod didn't even get the title king, although we sometimes see that in the translations. In fact, he was given a lesser title, this sort of hired lackey who rules some people maybe. He has a lot of responsibility, very little authority. Beyond that, look at what he's trying to do. We read in the Psalms that God is the king of Israel. And yet here is Herod trying to hold Israel together as a kind of political thing. His main thing is to say, well, okay, fine, these foreigners are ruling us and we're not able to follow God's law exactly, but at least we still have these sort of sham political units left. At least we're kind of who we used to be. We kind of get to call ourselves Israel still, or Judah still, or whatever else we may be. And for this, he isn't liked by anyone either. He's as unpopular as the Pharisees are, just for different reasons. He, of course, is hoping not to meet God in Jerusalem. Because if he does, the reign of God will surely shut down his own reign, however threadbare it may be. Once again, when the power of this world, which can deliver pain and death and not much else, encounters the power of God, we discover how thin and how insignificant the power of this world really is. Then there's the crowd. We often overlook the crowd. I'll speak for myself in this. Often when I read these stories, I see Jesus, I see the person Jesus is talking to, I might see a few of his followers standing around, but I tend to neglect the fact that there's an enormous number of other people standing around when Jesus is in the market or in the synagogue or down by the lakeside where for some reason 5,000 people have showed up expecting to be fed. All these people who are there, and all the people who've just happened to go by, who had no intention of being there. Every one of them brings his or her pain and joy, expectations, hopes and dreams, desires for God, images of God. All of that comes together in all of these people, just as it does with us. Whenever any group of faithful people is gathered together, there will be an almost infinite number of things that they want God to do, they want God to know, they want God to fix. Elsewhere, Jesus calls the crowd sheep without a shepherd. It seems like it fits the variety of concerns that they have, which maybe can be boiled down to they want God to act powerfully in their lives in some way. And so it is that as they go to Jerusalem, they're hoping that God will act there. It's not going to be that long before we get to Palm Sunday. And in fact, the crowd is there shouting, Hosanna, blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord. The irony of that is that that's from what's called the Howell Psalms. It's a group of psalms that pilgrims sang as they made the trip up the hill into Jerusalem. They're still recited on major Jewish holidays. So they got the right idea. They know where they're going and why they're doing it. But the words kind of ring hollow when we see what happens after Palm Sunday. And so in fact, the crowd has its own issues when it doesn't get what it thinks it wanted. Then there's Jerusalem itself, which again gets a bad rap because it turns out that almost whenever any large number of deeply religious people get together, a riot breaks out. That may seem odd to us, but just imagine the last time you were in a vestry that didn't have some conflict. It will happen. Whenever people who are passionate about anything get together, there will be friction. It's not necessarily something to be avoided, but it is something to be noticed. Jerusalem is a pretty good symbol of how we deal with conflict, or indeed how we don't deal with conflict, and a pretty good symbol for how we honor God. The place where we worship also turns out to be the place where we fight. Jerusalem is not that far from destruction at this point in the story. It's only shortly after the life and death of Jesus that the Romans said they decide they've had enough of it. They go in, demolish the temple, run most of the people out of town, and whatever glory Jerusalem may have had is gone. But for now, it waits to be the stage set where the final confrontation between God and the evils of humanity will be worked out. Which brings us to Jesus, who is at the center of the story. He describes himself as a prophet, but plainly he's more than a prophet. He is on his way to do God's work, to transform everything, to transform death itself. What prophet could do that? Jesus is ready to take that final step, probably more ready than everybody else is in the story that we hear this morning. He knows what his purpose is, which is more than most of the other people in the story can say. And so he says to them, "You will see me fully when those words are spoken, which are the words of pilgrims going into the holy city, ready to make their offering to God." That might be enough. There's plenty to chew on there for us as faithful people, but it's not enough. Because we're hearing this story during Lent. There must be a reason. It's not that long now until Easter, dear friends. You and I must remember that we also are on the way to Jerusalem, every one of us in our lives. Now is the time for us to decide what we're doing on that trip, why we're making that trip, what our intention is. The Catholic theologian Charles Keating said, and I'm paraphrasing, that it's impossible to fully understand Easter, to enter into the mystery of Easter without a radical transformation of our motivation. If we are headed to Jerusalem for the wrong reason, if we're headed to Jerusalem for any reason other than to walk with Jesus, then we are setting ourselves up to be disappointed at the very least, and possibly much worse. So, dear friends, we are at that point where we stop for the day. We have reached the village in between walks. Now is the time when we can decide what it is we're going to do when we wake up tomorrow and continue the walk. Who we are walking with, why we're headed to the destination. It will come. It is for us to decide what we will find when we get there. Amen.